There's something happening right now that almost nobody wants to say out loud on television, and once you hear it, you're not going to be able to unhear it. Guys, the most untouchable alliance in modern American politics is starting to crack, not because of some outside enemy, not because of a scandal, but because the people who used to defend it without blinking are quietly backing away. Stay with me for the next few minutes because by the end of this, you're going to understand something about global power that most news anchors either don't see or won't say. Let's start with what you can actually measure, the part that isn't speculation. A few weeks ago, in one of the most politically safe environments imaginable for unconditional pro-Israel politics, Manhattan, wealthy, connected, plugged into decades-old donor networks, something happened that should have been impossible 10 years ago. Candidates who openly criticized unconditional U.S. backing for Israel didn't just win, they won decisively. In one race, two Jewish candidates ran against each other, and the one who said American support had gone too far came out on top. Now think about that for a second. That headline barely made the front page. Why? Because it's not an isolated blip anymore, it's part of a pattern. And here's where it gets interesting, because the pattern isn't limited to one demographic. Polling over the past several years suggests support for the current Israeli government's conduct has been steadily dropping, especially among younger voters across the political spectrum. But the bigger shift, the one that genuinely seems to be catching political strategists off guard, is happening inside the evangelical Christian community, historically Israel's most loyal, highest turnout political base in America for generations. That coalition isn't falling apart overnight, nobody's claiming that, but cracks are appearing. Younger evangelicals are watching the same footage everyone else is watching, the bombing campaigns, the displacement, the home demolitions in the West Bank, and a growing number of them are reportedly starting to ask whether what they're seeing lines up with the faith they were raised in. And here's the thing about alliances built partly on theology. Once the theological foundation starts to wobble, the alliance doesn't survive forever just on habit and inertia. Now zoom out, because globally, the trend is even starker. International polling organizations that track favorability toward Israel across dozens of countries have reported a fairly consistent downward trend over the past couple of years, including in nations that were historically neutral or even friendly. People everywhere have been watching, in real time, on every phone screen on the planet, a level of destruction and civilian death in Gaza that a lot of analysts describe as almost impossible to fully rationalize publicly, and then watched similar dynamics extend into the West Bank and into southern Lebanon. You can only ask global public opinion to look away for so long before it simply stops cooperating. So here's the uncomfortable bottom line, according to several foreign policy analysts. Outside of the US government, and arguably Germany, for reasons tied more to its own 20th century history than to anything happening today, there isn't much of a major institutional backer left standing. And even the American relationship, historically the load-bearing pillar of the entire structure, appears to be showing real strain for what might be the first time in a generation. Does that make sense so far? Good. Because now we have to go back and actually understand what this project was in the first place. This didn't start last year, and it didn't start with this war. It goes back decades, and it has a name that rarely gets said out loud on American television: the idea of a greater Israel. This is the concept, and again, this is a real ideological current within Israeli politics, not a fringe conspiracy theory, that the territory captured in the 1967 war, including the West Bank, parts of southern Lebanon, and the Golan, shouldn't just be held temporarily as a security buffer, but settled and governed permanently. This isn't some hidden secret either. It's been written into the founding documents of the political movement that has dominated Israeli politics for most of the last 30 years, which has historically stated that there will be only one sovereignty between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, explicitly ruling out ceding that territory to any other administration. That's not rhetoric from some extreme fringe voice. That's been the stated platform of a governing party going back decades, before most of today's policymakers were even in office. So when people hear the phrase, "from the river to the sea," and assume it must be some radical slogan invented by one side, it's worth knowing, and this is important, that the exact same geographic claim, word for word in spirit, has appeared in mainstream Israeli political platforms for just as long. Neither side invented that phrase. Both sides have used some version of it. And this is precisely why, some analysts argue, a genuine two-state solution has never actually been allowed to fully materialize, even though every American administration since the 1990s has publicly claimed to support one. Go back to the original UN partition plan after the British Mandate ended. The Arab states rejected it at the time. That's documented, that's not in dispute. But even that controversial plan set aside a meaningful share of land for a Palestinian state. After the 1948 war, the territory under Israeli control expanded well beyond that. After 1967, it expanded again. And at each stage, one possible explanation offered by critics is that the documented political program of the dominant Israeli political movement remained consistent. No fully sovereign Palestinian state. Not a smaller one. Not a demilitarized one. None at all. Which raises an obvious question, and I want you to actually sit with this one for a second. If there's no Palestinian state, and there are roughly 8 million Palestinian Arabs living in that same territory, what's supposed to happen to them long term? Logically, there are only a handful of possible outcomes, and none of them are comfortable to talk about. Either they receive full and equal citizenship inside a single democratic state, something Israeli leadership has historically rejected, or they continue living under a system that human rights organizations and many legal scholars describe as separate and unequal, administered by a military authority without full political representation, or ENTA. And this is the scenario a lot of international observers say they've watched intensify over the past 2 years. There's continued pressure through military operations, home demolitions, and settler expansion in the West Bank that critics characterize as a slow-motion displacement campaign. Now that's a serious allegation, and it's contested. Israeli officials reject that characterization and frame these actions as security measures. But it's worth understanding why so many outside observers have reached that conclusion. Because once you frame it that way, here's where the bigger picture starts to make a grim kind of sense, even if it's a logic nobody in power wanted to state plainly at the time. If there's never going to be a negotiated Palestinian state, there's always going to be resistance to that arrangement, armed and otherwise. And if the strategic goal becomes suppressing that resistance permanently, rather than resolving what's causing it, then logically, you eventually have to confront every government in the region that provides that resistance political cover, financial backing, or safe harbor. Some analysts point to Iraq, some point to Syria, some point to Libya, and the biggest prize of all, the one that's reportedly occupied an entire generation of American foreign policy strategists, is Iran. None of those conflicts happened in a vacuum, according to this line of analysis. The public case for invading Iraq in 2003 centered on weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist. But underneath that public justification, there was, according to documents and policy discussions from years before the war, a broader strategic conversation happening in Washington think tanks about reshaping the political map of the Middle East, partly by weakening governments aligned with the Palestinian cause and close to Iran. Syria's government, similarly, was pushed into over a decade of catastrophic civil war for reasons that overlap significantly with that same underlying calculation, according to several regional analysts. And now you have an ongoing high-stakes confrontation with Iran, framed publicly around nuclear non-proliferation, but which some observers trace back to that same multi-decade refusal to allow a negotiated Palestinian state to exist alongside Israel. So here's a real question worth asking. Why has American foreign policy been locked into this cycle of intervention after intervention for 30 years at a staggering cost in lives, money, and international credibility? One possible explanation, and again this is interpretation, not a settled fact, isn't really about any single threat at all. It's about a foundational decision made decades ago to back permanent Israeli control over land that international law, the United Nations, and most of the world's governments say belongs at least partly to someone else. And once you commit to defending an arrangement that has no clear political resolution, you commit yourself to an essentially endless list of adversaries. Because resistance to an unresolved grievance doesn't just disappear, it tends to change shape, generation after generation. Now here's the part worth genuinely sitting with, because it's not really a partisan talking point, and it's not purely a moral argument either, although the moral dimension is hard to ignore given the scale of civilian death in Gaza over the past 2 years. It's more of a practical observation about how political arrangements sustain themselves over time. A one-state system where one population governs another population that has no political voice doesn't tend to have a stable long-term equilibrium. Historically, arrangements like that either evolve toward genuine equal citizenship for everyone living in that territory, or they require permanent, escalating force to maintain. Checkpoints, walls, demolitions, expulsions, recurring conflict. There's rarely a third option where you simply freeze the situation in place indefinitely, because the population on the losing end of that arrangement generally doesn't agree to stay quiet forever. And, this is the new variable, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily agree to keep funding it indefinitely either. That second part appears to be exactly what's breaking down right now in real time. For decades, this entire structure survived largely because it had one government willing to underwrite it politically, diplomatically, and militarily, almost regardless of the human cost, and willing to treat criticism of that arrangement as something close to politically untouchable in mainstream discourse. That's eroding, not because of one single event, but because of an accumulation. 2 years of around-the-clock footage out of Gaza, expanding settlement activity and violence in the West Bank, military operations extending into southern Lebanon, polling that shows the policy becoming increasingly isolated from global public opinion. And now, finally, visible cracks inside the domestic political coalitions that used to make unconditional support feel automatic and politically risk-free. Which brings us back to the actual choice that's apparently been sitting on the table this entire